The encounter. Nia Taylor moved with purpose. The weight of her gym bag settled across her shoulders. Its strap dug into the side of her neck. She had just finished an intense workout session at a nearby fitness center, her muscles aching with the familiar burn of exertion. As the sun dipped lower into the sky, casting a warm golden hue across the city, Nia barely noticed the beauty of the moment. Her mind, trained through years of Navy SEAL discipline, was on alert, scanning her surroundings without her conscious awareness. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about being prepared. Life had taught Nia that threats didn't always come in the form of military exercises or international missions. Sometimes, danger hid in the shadows of everyday life. In the people who walked past you on a crowded street, in the jeers of strangers who thought they could diminish you with their words. She had seen it all, survived it all, and come out stronger each time. The city was alive with the typical afternoon chaos. Cars honked in a symphony of impatience, and people hustled by, lost in their own worlds. Nia's sneakers tapped a steady rhythm on the pavement, each step in sync with the beats of the city. Her posture was straight, her movements deliberate, as though nothing could disturb the calm within her. Yet even as she walked with the confidence of someone who had faced death and walked away victorious, she knew better than to assume there wasn't trouble lurking around the corner. As she passed an alleyway, her sharp eyes flicked to the small group of men standing against the graffiti-scarred wall. Their voices reached her before their faces did, the harsh, booming laughter of Greg Thompson piercing through the sounds of the street. She knew the type. Loud, cocky, looking for a reason to assert dominance. Her gaze slid over them briefly, but she didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. They were nothing to her. Still, they noticed her. "Yo, check her out." Greg's voice was a little too loud, too pointed. He elbowed his friends, making sure they were all paying attention. Now that's something worth looking at. Paul, the taller of the three, grinned like a wolf spotting prey. "Yeah, walking around here like she's too good for the rest of us." Ryan, the third member of the group, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting nervously between Nia and the others. "Bet she's one of those high-class types. Thinks she's untouchable." Nia didn't flinch. Her body continued its rhythmic stride, as though she hadn't heard a thing, but in the back of her mind, she catalogued every word, every sound. The subtle shift in Greg's posture as he watched her, the change in the tone of their voices. These were men who were used to pushing boundaries, seeing how far they could go before someone pushed back. And right now, they were testing Nia. They followed her for a few paces, their voices rising as they grew bolder. The jeers and taunts seemed to have no end, each one more piercing than the last. Yet Nia, despite every word, every insult, showed no sign of slowing down. "Hey, sweetheart." Greg's voice echoed down the street now, a deliberate loudness to it. "In a hurry. We're just trying to be friendly." She didn't answer. She wasn't interested in what they had to say. "Come on, Paul. She doesn't even have the decency to say hello." "That's rude." The words dripped from Greg's mouth like venom, designed to provoke, to bait her into a reaction. Nia's grip on the strap of her gym bag tightened. She was no stranger to this. The undercurrents of racial prejudice, the assumption that because she was black, she was easy prey. It wasn't new. But what they didn't know was that Nia wasn't someone who took insults lying down. And they had no idea just how far she would go when pushed. Behind her, the sounds of their footsteps grew louder, their taunts sharper. She could hear them like a buzzing fly at the back of her mind, trying to claw its way into her peace. She was calm, but that calm was the calm before the storm. She had faced worse than these men, much worse, and emerged unscathed. But this time, it was different. These men weren't just disrespecting her. They were testing something deeper, something more dangerous. As they continued to follow, their voices blending with the sounds of the street, Nia's mind began to calculate. She didn't need to break stride to be effective. It wasn't about fighting back immediately. It was about understanding her enemy, understanding the situation. Greg, sensing her indifference, grew bolder still. Bet she thinks she's royalty or something. He jeered, his voice filled with mockery. You think you're too good for us, huh? There it was. The moment when the line crossed from simple harassment to something darker. The moment when they felt entitled to belittle her for no reason other than their own sense of superiority. Nia's eyes narrowed, her jaw set, but her movements didn't change. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a visible reaction. She wasn't going to let them see how much they'd gotten under her skin. Instead, she focused on their positions, where they stood, where they were walking, where their energy was shifting. Her sharp ears picked up every word. She felt the aggression building behind her, growing with each step they took closer to her. In an instant, she could have taken action. But she didn't. Not yet. Not until it was necessary. For now, she was the calm in the storm. Her eyes shifted sideways, briefly catching the glint of the afternoon sun off a piece of broken glass on the sidewalk. It was small, almost insignificant, but it served as a reminder that everything in the world, no matter how sharp or dangerous, could be turned to her advantage if the situation called for it. Nia Taylor didn't move. She just kept walking. But deep inside, she was already preparing for the inevitable confrontation. And when the moment came, she would strike with precision, not anger. She had been trained to fight with purpose, not emotion. And these men were about to learn exactly why you didn't mess with someone who had nothing to lose. The moment of reckoning. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden hue painting the city in shades of warmth and illusion, as though everything was calm and normal. But Nia knew better. She had been trained to read the subtleties of the world around her, to understand the moment before things went wrong. And right now, everything about her environment screamed that something was about to break. Greg Thompson, Paul, and Ryan were still following her, their footsteps almost synchronized now, the sound of their shoes scraping against the pavement growing louder, more insistent. They hadn't yet made their move, but they were closing in. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with unspoken intentions. Nia could hear the growing unease in their voices as they realized they weren't getting the reaction they were hoping for. She had ignored their taunts, their insults, their jeers. She had remained focused, steady, and unshaken. And that perhaps was what made them even more determined. "Hey, why you ignoring us?" Greg called out again, louder now. His voice was thick with frustration, the challenge unmistakable. "You think you're better than us or something." The words hung in the air for a beat, and then came Paul's voice, a hint of anger seeping into his tone. "What's your problem, huh? We just want to talk. You think you're too good for us." The implication was clear. They were used to people cowering, to women flinching at their attention, to men getting intimidated when they walked too close. They had tried the baiting game, and it hadn't worked, but they weren't ready to back off yet. Nia's pace remained steady, her face expressionless. Inside, however, her mind was calculating with military precision. She could hear every step, every breath they took. She knew that Greg was the most vocal, trying to assert his dominance. Paul, though more quiet, was probably the most dangerous. His silence spoke of someone who had learned to wait for the right moment. And Ryan, the follower, was the most unpredictable. His nervous energy was like a live wire, ready to snap at any moment. Nia adjusted her grip on the strap of her gym bag, fingers curling around it with practiced ease. She wasn't holding it like a victim. She was holding it like a weapon. She had no intention of letting this escalate into something worse than it had to be, but she would not let them make her their target. These men had no idea what they were dealing with. She had trained for this. No, she had survived for this. Every battle in her past had brought her here, to this moment in time, where she would face the very thing she had sworn to protect herself from: unnecessary aggression, unwarranted violence, and men who thought their skin and words gave them the power to diminish others. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her voice low but carrying in the cool evening air. "You think you can scare me, But you're the ones who should be scared." Greg's laughter broke out, his bravado covering the sting of her words. "What? You think you're some kind of hero, lady? You think you can take on all three of us? You're alone out here. What makes you think you can?" The moment he took a step closer, Nia's eyes flashed. She could hear his footsteps, feel his weight shift, and before he could say another word, she pivoted. Her movements were fluid and precise, like a predator striking its prey with nothing more than instinct. Greg's confident grin faltered as Nia turned to face him fully. In that split second, he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tighten, a kind of cold determination that sent an uncomfortable ripple of fear down his spine. Nia didn't wait for him to process. With a swift, practiced motion, she swung her gym bag forward, using it like a whip to smack the side of his head. The strap caught him across the ear, and he stumbled back, his hand shooting up instinctively to protect his face. But Nia was already a step ahead. In one fluid motion, she took advantage of his stumble and closed the distance between them. She kicked his feet out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. His startled yell was cut off by the harsh impact of his body hitting the pavement, and for a moment, the street was silent except for the distant sounds of car engines and the faint hum of city life. Paul and Ryan hesitated. They had expected this to be a fight of words, not physicality. They had expected a scared woman who would back down. Instead, they were confronted by a woman who had shattered their expectations in an instant, leaving Greg sprawled on the ground, dazed and vulnerable. "You." Nia's voice was calm but deadly, her eyes now locking on Paul. "You should think long and hard before you decide to follow his lead." Paul blinked, the mockery in his eyes replaced by the dawning realization that he was no longer in control. He had underestimated her. Now, there was a flicker of doubt in his stance. He took a half step back, his hand instinctively reaching for something in his jacket pocket. Ryan, meanwhile, was watching Nia with a mixture of fear and confusion. He couldn't understand what had just happened. 1 minute, they were having fun, pushing buttons, trying to get a reaction out of a woman they thought was weak. The next, they were standing in the middle of the street, looking at a woman who had dropped their leader in seconds. This wasn't part of the plan. Nia took another step forward, her feet quiet against the pavement as she approached Paul, her eyes never leaving his. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to make a scene. She only needed to make it clear that this was her city, and she wouldn't tolerate anyone thinking they could walk over her, or anyone else, for that matter. "You don't get it," she said, her voice colder now, as though she were explaining something to a child who had made a foolish mistake. "This isn't about you or me. This is about you thinking you can terrorize anyone without consequence. But now, I'm going to make you see that your actions have a price. You're not the predator here. I am." Ryan took a step back, his face a mask of nervous energy. "We didn't mean." "Shut up." Nia cut him off sharply. She didn't need their excuses. "You're not going to talk your way out of this." She shifted her gaze back to Greg, who was still sprawled on the ground, trying to push himself up, blood beginning to trickle from the side of his face where the bag had struck him. He looked up at her with hatred, but there was no longer any confidence in his eyes. Paul looked at Ryan, the tension between them thick. They were realizing just how far they had pushed things, and it was no longer about proving a point. They were on the defensive, and Nia knew this was her moment. Nia stepped closer, her eyes never wavering. "You have two choices right now," she said, her voice unwavering. "You can walk away and forget this ever happened, or you can stay and face the consequences. But if you stay, make no mistake, you'll be facing a woman who has nothing to lose and everything to prove." She let the silence stretch out between them, her words hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. It was a test of their will, their resolve. She had drawn the line, and now it was up to them to decide if they were brave enough to cross it. But in their hesitation, Nia saw everything she needed to know. They weren't brave. They were scared. And that fear would be their undoing. The hunt begins. The silence that followed Nia's declaration was thick, almost suffocating. Greg, still trying to recover from his fall, grimaced as he wiped the blood from his forehead. His earlier bravado now reduced to a simmering fury. Paul and Ryan, both unnerved by the sudden shift in power, exchanged looks, their bodies tense and unsure. Nia's eyes never left them. She had already assessed the situation, already calculated her next move, and now it was time to put it into action. She had offered them a choice: walk away or face the consequences. She didn't expect them to walk away, though. Men like Greg, Paul, and Ryan didn't give up easily. They thought they could bully and intimidate their way through life. And now, they were about to learn the hard way that not everyone could be cowed by their antics. Greg was the first to speak, his voice low and venomous. "You really think you've got us figured out, huh? You're just some freaking soldier, lady. You think you scare us." Nia didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her presence spoke louder than any words ever could. The three of them were slowly circling around her now, trying to size her up, but Nia was one step ahead. She knew exactly how this game played out. She had been trained to face enemies that were bigger, stronger, and more dangerous. These men, they were nothing in comparison. Without warning, Nia moved. Her feet carried her swiftly across the street, her body flowing with practiced grace. She wasn't running. She was just positioning herself. She had to separate them, take away their unity. Men like these were emboldened by numbers. She knew she couldn't let them stay together if she wanted to neutralize them one by one. Greg cursed under his breath, his eyes flicking to Paul, then Ryan. He wasn't sure what Nia was up to, but the sharp edge of fear was beginning to creep into his voice. "You think you can take all three of us?" He spat, but there was a crack in his bravado now. Nia, still moving with calculated precision, didn't even answer. She had no intention of making this a fair fight. Fairness was for those who were afraid to win. She knew how to survive, and that was all that mattered. The men hesitated for a split second too long. That moment of doubt was all Nia needed. She moved again, this time in a flash. She darted toward Ryan, who had been lingering at the back, unsure of what to do. His nerves were already on edge, and when Nia closed the distance, his entire body tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for something hidden inside his jacket. But Nia was faster. She caught his wrist before he could even make a move, twisting his arm with a fluid motion that left him stumbling forward, his face contorted in pain. He let out a yelp of surprise and fear as she shoved him back, sending him crashing into a nearby dumpster. Ryan scrambled to get up, his hands shaking. Nia wasn't even looking at him anymore. She had already turned her attention to Greg and Paul. "That's your first mistake," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Underestimating me." Greg, still on the ground, pushed himself up with a snarl. His face was flushed with anger, but now there was something else in his eyes. Fear. It wasn't the fear of physical pain. It was the fear of being exposed, of having his arrogance stripped away. And in that moment, Nia understood exactly what these men feared the most: the realization that their false sense of superiority would never protect them in a world where real power came from knowledge, skill, and control. "She's just one woman," Greg muttered to himself, trying to convince himself that this situation wasn't spiraling out of control. He looked at Paul, who had remained eerily silent, his face set in a mask of uncertainty. Paul, realizing that the situation had gone far beyond anything they had anticipated, took a deep breath. He moved toward Nia with his hands raised in an almost pacifying gesture, trying to buy time, trying to regain the upper hand. "Look, lady, we don't want any trouble," he said, his voice strained. "We're just messing around." Nia raised an eyebrow, unfazed by his attempt to de-escalate the situation. "Messing around," she repeated, her tone cool. "Is that what you call it? Because last I checked, harassment and assault weren't just messing around." Paul opened his mouth to speak again, but Nia wasn't interested in hearing his excuses. Instead, she launched forward, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Her hands grabbed his wrist, twisting it with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. His body lurched forward in response, and Nia drove her elbow into his ribs, hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Paul gasped for air, his eyes wide with shock. But Nia wasn't done. She shoved him backward, sending him stumbling away from her with the force of a freight train. He collided with a parked car, his back slamming into it with a sickening thud. He slumped to the ground, groaning in pain, completely stunned by the speed and force of her attack. Now it was just Greg and Ryan. Greg's face twisted in fury. "You think you've won, huh? You think you're the big hero here?" Nia didn't answer. Instead, she turned her gaze to Ryan, who was still trying to get to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, his eyes wide with terror. His earlier bravado was long gone, replaced by the realization that he was in way over his head. "You should have left when you had the chance," Nia said, her voice calm but laced with an undeniable edge. "Now you've made it personal." Ryan took a hesitant step back, his eyes flicking between Nia and the two men who were now out of the fight. Greg was still standing, but he wasn't the same man who had been laughing a few minutes ago. The fear in his eyes was unmistakable. He was no longer in control of the situation. With no words left to say, Nia took her next step. Her movement was a blur, so fast that even Greg didn't have time to react. She grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and spun him around, slamming him against the side of the building. His breath left his chest in a violent gasp, his body crumpling against the wall as he struggled to regain his footing. "You didn't think this through, did you?" Nia asked, her face inches from his. "You thought you could walk around and intimidate people, throw around words like they meant something. But the truth is, you've been living in a fantasy. And now you're awake." Greg tried to push back, but Nia's grip tightened. "You'll regret ever thinking you could take me down." Nia let the words hang in the air, and for a moment, everything was still. The city noises faded into the background as she let the weight of her actions settle. These men weren't just guilty of harassing a woman. They were guilty of underestimating the strength of someone they couldn't possibly understand. And Nia, she wasn't finished yet. She wasn't just going to walk away and let them slink off into the shadows. No, she would make sure this moment became a lesson they would never forget. She would hunt them down one by one, expose their cowardice, and ensure they never believed they could walk through this world without consequences ever again. This was just the beginning. The chase. The cold reality of the street pressed in around Nia as she stood over Greg, his body crumpled against the side of the building, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of distant traffic, the hum of city life. These things were lost to her now. Her focus was sharp, her mind a machine calculating the next moves with surgical precision. There was no turning back from here. She had crossed the line with them, and there would be no mercy. Greg's eyes flicked up to hers, wide with a mixture of disbelief and fear. He had underestimated her. Hell, they all had. And now, as he realized the full extent of what he had provoked, the anger that once fueled him was quickly replaced by something darker, the fear of retribution. But Nia wasn't interested in his fear. She had no desire for him to beg or to cower. This wasn't about personal vengeance. This was about balance, about ensuring that people like Greg, Paul, and Ryan knew there were consequences to their actions. Behind her, she could hear Ryan scrambling, his voice almost a whimper. "Greg, come on, man, we gotta get out of here." Nia didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. Ryan was panicking, trying to drag his friends out of this situation before it got worse. And it would. She wasn't going to let them go until they understood the cost of their arrogance. "You're not going anywhere," Nia said, her voice low. "Steady. Not yet." Ryan froze in his tracks. His body was tense, caught between fear and the instinct to run. He hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. And now that they had, he was trapped in the chaos he had helped create. But Nia wasn't just closing in on him physically. She was closing in on something much deeper, his fear of being exposed for what he truly was. Turning slowly, Nia kept her eyes fixed on Greg for a moment longer. He was still dazed, his pride broken into pieces, but he would recover soon enough. And when he did, he would be running from the consequences of his actions. Nia knew that wasn't going to be enough for her, though. She couldn't just let them slip away into the anonymity of the city. Not after everything they'd done. Without warning, she spun on her heel and moved toward Ryan, who had started to back away, panic written all over his face. He was too slow, too unsure of what he was doing, and before he could even think about escaping, Nia had already closed the distance. She moved fast, too fast for him to react, and grabbed him by the collar of his jacket, pulling him toward her with a force that left him gasping. "You want to run," she whispered, her breath steady against his ear. "You're not going anywhere." Ryan trembled beneath her grip, his body stiff with fear, his eyes darting desperately for an escape route that didn't exist. "Let me go," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We're sorry. We didn't mean it." But Nia's expression remained unmoving. She had no interest in his apologies. She had seen people like him before, people who only understood the weight of their actions when it was too late. He didn't deserve mercy, not after what he had tried to do. And he certainly wasn't going to walk away untouched. Nia pulled him closer, her fingers digging into his jacket as she narrowed her eyes. "You don't get to say sorry now," she said, her voice ice cold. "You're not the victim here. You think you can treat people like that, then run away when things get real. Not this time." Ryan's breathing was rapid, shallow as he struggled against her grip. He was scared. Nia could see it. The terror in his eyes, the way his legs wobbled beneath him. But Nia wasn't going to let him off the hook. Not yet. She leaned in closer, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "I don't care if you were just following orders. I don't care if you were just playing the part of the tough guy. What I care about is that you understand that your actions have consequences. You will think twice before you ever try something like this again." Ryan's face twisted with a mix of fear and frustration. "Please just let me go," he begged, his voice barely a whisper. Nia stared him down, her grip tightening for just a moment, before she slowly released him. He stumbled backward, his body shaking, but she didn't let him run. Not yet, not until she made sure he understood what he had done. "Consider this a warning," Nia said, her voice firm, the weight of her words heavy in the air. "You're lucky I'm letting you go. But don't think for 1 second that this is over. You've made a choice today, and that choice will follow you." Ryan didn't say anything more. His mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. He turned quickly, his feet skittering on the pavement as he rushed toward Greg, who was still recovering from his fall. Nia watched them, her eyes locked on the two men who had thought they could walk through life without consequences. They were running now, moving away from the scene with their tails between their legs, no longer the confident gang of bullies they had once been. They had been stripped of their bravado, their pride broken in a matter of minutes. Nia hadn't needed to strike them down physically. Their own fear had done the work for her. But that wasn't enough. Not for Nia. She wasn't going to let them just disappear into the city, continue their lives without facing the truth of what they had done. She needed to make sure the message was clear. She followed them, keeping her distance, moving like a shadow through the streets. The city was her hunting ground, and the hunt wasn't over yet. Greg and Ryan led the way, their footsteps hurried and frantic, the fear in their eyes now undeniable. They passed through alleys, ducked into narrow side streets, but Nia was relentless. She moved swiftly, her body weaving through the crowd like water through a stream, undetected by the busy pedestrians who went about their day. She wasn't going to let them go. Not yet. Nia had learned the art of patience during her years in the Navy SEALs, and now she used that skill to her advantage. She stalked them, waiting for the right moment. And when it came, she struck. She cornered them in an alley, the three men panting from the run, their eyes wide with panic as they realized they had nowhere to go. Nia emerged from the shadows like a force of nature. Her presence was overwhelming, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to their frantic energy. "Did you really think you could escape?" she asked, her voice calm, almost conversational, but with a cold edge that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Greg tried to push forward, his body tense, ready to throw a punch. But Nia was faster. She moved in close, grabbed his wrist, and twisted with such force that he gasped, his body forced to its knees. "This is where it ends," Nia said softly, her face stoic. "You're not going to get away with this." She didn't need to say more. The fear in their eyes told her everything she needed to know. She had made her point. The hunt was over. The consequences had been delivered. And Nia Taylor, Navy SEAL, had made sure that the streets were safe, at least for now. Unraveling the lies. The alley was quiet now, save for the heavy breathing of Greg, Ryan, and Paul. They had nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide from the consequences of their actions. The cold night air clung to them like a shroud, and in the dim light from the flickering street lamp overhead, Nia stood in front of them like a looming figure of justice, unmoving, unfazed by the way they cowered before her. Greg had tried to play the tough guy, had thought he could intimidate her, make her back down. He was learning now, the hard way, that some things couldn't be bullied or threatened. Ryan and Paul, once so sure of themselves, were now silent, their faces pale, their eyes darting around as if looking for a way to escape. But escape was no longer an option. Nia hadn't come to beat them up, though that could have been easy enough. She hadn't come to exact revenge. What she was doing was far more important. She wasn't going to just leave it at a personal victory. No, Nia needed to show them, and everyone else who might be watching, that their behavior had far-reaching consequences. They needed to understand that actions like theirs were part of something bigger, a system of unchecked privilege and indifference that allowed men like them to think they could harass, belittle, and intimidate anyone they chose. "Why did you do it?" Nia's voice cut through the thick silence, her tone cold and deliberate. She didn't move as she spoke, her posture solid and unwavering. She wasn't just asking for answers, she was demanding them. Greg, still kneeling on the ground, glared up at her, his pride crumpled but his anger not quite gone. "We were just having fun, all right. It was a joke. Nothing serious. A joke." Nia's eyebrows rose, her voice laced with disbelief. "You call harassing a woman on the street a joke? You think that's funny?" Paul shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flitting between Nia and his friends. He hadn't expected things to spiral so far out of control. He opened his mouth to speak, but Nia cut him off. "Save it," she snapped, her tone sharp as a blade. "You didn't just make a joke, Paul. You and your friends thought you could push me, make me feel small, because that's what you're used to doing. You think the world owes you something because of the color of your skin or the way you speak. But you're wrong." Ryan took a half step forward, his voice trembling. "We didn't mean no harm. We were just messing around. It wasn't like we were gonna." "Shut up," Nia interrupted. "It doesn't matter if you meant harm or not. It doesn't matter if it was a joke. You crossed a line. And now you're going to face the reality of your actions. You think people are supposed to laugh at your cruelty, that they're supposed to let it slide. That's not how it works." She stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied each of them in turn. "You don't get to decide how people react. You don't get to decide who gets to be harassed and who gets to walk away unscathed. You see, what you've done goes deeper than just me. It's about the countless people, especially women, especially people of color, who have had to put up with this same nonsense day in and day out, just because some people think they're entitled to be rude, to be cruel, to belittle someone who doesn't look like them." Greg, still kneeling, gritted his teeth, trying to muster whatever defiance he could. "What are you gonna do, huh? Call the cops? They'll just let us go. Nothing will happen." Nia's expression softened, but only slightly. I'm not calling the cops, Greg. You're right about one thing, though. The system doesn't always punish people like you. But that's about to change. See, I'm not here for vengeance, but I am here to show you how deep this problem really runs. You're not just going to walk away from this and think that it's all behind you. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us. She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. She could see the flickers of understanding, maybe even fear, slowly growing in their eyes. But Nia wasn't done yet. You're not the first to think that harassing people is okay. You're not the first to think that you can do whatever you want to people like me, to people who are different from you, and you won't be the last. She took a step back and glanced over her shoulder, her gaze shifting to the quiet city that stretched out beyond the alley. But here's the thing. You've just become an example, not just for you three, but for anyone who thinks they can get away with it. She turned back to face them, her eyes sharp. You see, I've been in situations where people like you, people with power, with privilege, have assumed they could do whatever they wanted because no one would stop them. I was trained to stop them, trained to fight against people like you. And now you're going to see what happens when you push the wrong person. Greg stood up shakily, wiping blood from his lip. His pride was taking a hit, but his arrogance still simmered beneath the surface. So, what now? You just walk away from this, like nothing happened. Nia shook her head slowly, her voice low and controlled. No, you'll face the consequences of your actions. Not from me, not from the police, but from the system you've been part of. The system that's let you and people like you get away with treating others like they don't matter. But things are changing. And you just got caught in the wave. Her gaze flicked between the three of them one last time. And when you leave here tonight, you'll have to answer one question. Are you going to keep thinking you can treat people this way? Or are you going to understand the lesson I've just taught you? Paul, still on the ground, swallowed hard. We didn't mean to. We weren't. Enough, Nia said, her voice rising with authority. I'm done listening to your excuses. You wanted to test your power over me. You wanted to make me your victim. But instead, you've shown everyone what kind of men you are. Weak, scared, and full of excuses. Ryan, who had been silent up until now, spoke in a quiet, almost pleading voice. What do you want from us? What happens now? Nia gave a final look to the trio. The fear in their eyes was genuine now, but it wasn't enough. They were going to have to carry this moment with them. The knowledge that they had crossed a line, that they had been made to understand the weight of their privilege, and the consequences of mistreating others. What happens now, Nia said, her voice steady and powerful, is that you'll walk away from here, and you'll never forget this. Not the way I stood up to you, and not the way the world is going to change around you. Because you're a part of a system that's already unraveling, and the days of bullying, of people thinking they can use fear to control others, are coming to an end. She turned to leave, her steps deliberate, her body language conveying strength and purpose. But as she walked away, she paused for just a moment, turning back to face them one last time. And when you go back to your lives, she said, her eyes meeting theirs one final time, remember this moment. Remember that every time you try to push someone down, there's someone else ready to stand up. And you'll never know when they might be standing right in front of you. With that, Nia walked away, her back straight and confident, leaving the three men to pick up the pieces of their shattered pride, their lives forever changed by the lesson they had just learned the hard way. The streets of the city seemed quieter now, as though the world had taken a collective breath. And for Nia, this was just one step towards something bigger, something more meaningful. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The aftermath. The city felt different in the hours after Nia's confrontation with Greg, Paul, and Ryan. The air was still thick with tension, yet something about the night seemed to have shifted. The events that had unfolded in that alley weren't just about one woman standing up for herself. They were a catalyst, a moment in time that exposed a deeper truth. A truth that could no longer be ignored, even if the world tried to sweep it under the rug. Nia walked through the streets, her mind processing everything that had happened. The adrenaline had started to wear off, replaced by the quiet hum of reflection. She had done what she set out to do. She had shown Greg and his friends that the world wasn't as forgiving as they thought. She had exposed the cracks in their worldview and in the system that had allowed their behavior to go unchecked for so long. But it wasn't enough. She knew this was just the beginning. As Nia made her way down the dimly lit sidewalk, her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar hum of her phone in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unrecognized number. Her thumb hovered over the notification, a flicker of curiosity flashing through her. "Is this Nia Taylor? I saw what happened tonight. I think it's time we talk." The message made her pause. A mix of emotions flooded her: confusion, curiosity, but also a slight twinge of unease. She knew that her actions that night hadn't just been witnessed by Greg and his friends. People had been watching. People always watched. She wasn't naive enough to think that this wouldn't ripple outward in ways she couldn't predict. She considered ignoring the message, walking away from whatever this was. But something told her that this was important. The tone of the message, the way the person had said, "I saw what happened," didn't feel like a threat. It felt like someone who understood, someone who might have seen beyond the surface of the moment and recognized the larger picture. She typed back a quick reply. "Who is this?" The response came swiftly. "Let's just say I'm someone who's been where you are. Meet me tomorrow. Same place, noon. You won't regret it." Nia hesitated for a moment, staring at the screen. She didn't trust easily, and she didn't like surprises, especially ones that had the potential to drag her into something bigger than she was prepared for. But the message, though cryptic, had struck a chord with her. Something in it felt right. She had been fighting a battle on her own for so long, but maybe, just maybe, this was the moment when things could change. She tucked the phone back into her pocket and glanced around the street. The city was still bustling, people going about their business as if nothing had happened. But Nia knew better. The world had been changed, just slightly, by what had occurred that night. The power dynamics that had once been so blatantly skewed in favor of people like Greg and his friends, those who thought they could do anything without consequence, had been cracked wide open. The cracks weren't visible to most, but Nia could see them, and she wasn't going to let them close. The next day came with the sharp sting of a new dawn. The sun had barely risen when Nia found herself back in the city, standing in the same alley where she had confronted Greg, Paul, and Ryan. She looked up and down the street, taking in the surroundings. There was a strange energy in the air, almost as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Nia didn't know who was going to show up, but she was prepared for anything. She stood tall, her posture exuding the quiet confidence that came from years of discipline and training. She was a Navy SEAL. She had survived the most intense situations imaginable. No message, no meeting, no surprise was going to throw her off balance. Minutes passed, and she was about to turn and leave when a figure stepped out from the shadows. A woman, dressed in plain but sharp clothing, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She approached Nia with a deliberate pace, her eyes sharp, scanning Nia as she walked closer. "You're Nia Taylor," the woman said, her voice steady, with an underlying current of respect. "I've been following your work." Nia's brow furrowed slightly. "My work? What do you mean?" The woman smiled, but it wasn't the smile of someone who was trying to make a joke. It was the smile of someone who understood exactly what Nia had been through. "I saw you take down those 3 men last night. The way you handled yourself, it's impressive. It reminded me of myself a long time ago." Nia took a cautious step back, her senses alert. "Who are you?" "My name's Jasmine," the woman said. "I've been involved in activism for years. But I'm also a part of something bigger, something you might be interested in." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "I've been where you are, Nia. I've been a soldier, a fighter. But I also seen what happens when people like you step up. The ones who are willing to face down the system, the ones who challenge it. People like us don't just get to walk away from that. Nia crossed her arms, her mind racing. She wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but there was a part of her that felt a tug, a pull toward something bigger than herself. What do you mean, people like us? Jasmine studied Nia for a moment, then nodded slowly. People who understand what it takes to fight for something real, something bigger than just themselves. I'm not talking about physical fights. I'm talking about the fight against systems that are built on oppression, inequality, and fear. You can break a man's jaw, Nia. You can knock him down, but the system that protects him will still stand. I'm talking about dismantling that system. The words hung heavy between them. Nia's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of what Jasmine was offering began to sink in. This wasn't just about one fight, one confrontation, one group of men. This was about something far bigger than she had ever imagined. You want me to join your fight? Nia asked, her voice steady despite the flurry of emotions rising within her. Jasmine's eyes softened, a knowing look in them. I want you to understand that your fight has only just begun. What happened last night? That was just a small victory, but the real battle is out there. And it's bigger than any one person. It's about fighting against the structures that allow men like Greg, Paul, and Ryan to act the way they do. It's about using your voice, your strength, your influence to change the world. Nia stood in silence for a long moment, considering the weight of Jasmine's words. She had never considered herself an activist, never thought of herself as someone who could challenge the system in the way Jasmine was describing. But the truth was, Nia had always fought for something deeper than herself, and perhaps this was the next step. I'm listening, Nia said finally, her voice low but determined. Jasmine smiled, a flicker of approval in her eyes. Good. We've got work to do, Nia. And you're the perfect person to help make it happen. As Nia followed Jasmine through the streets, something inside her shifted. This was more than a personal vendetta. This was the start of something much larger, a movement that had the power to ripple through the fabric of society and shake it to its core. Nia wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was part of a new mission, one that would change everything. And she was ready.